just clap so that we know that we're all ready to get started? Okay, thanks. That reminds me of my mecha days back in college. Okay, so my name is Paloma Bustos, and I am a Crime Survivor Services Program Manager here at the Rice Clinic. And just in case you haven't noticed from our program or from our t-shirts, RISE stands for Rights and Systems Enforced. And here at the clinic, what we try to do is we try to provide comprehensive services to the survivors that we represent. So not only are they getting legal representation to help them to protect and enforce their rights in the criminal justice system, but they also have me as a social worker. I'm a social worker by training. And so what I do is I co-teach the class with Professor Richard, because what we do here is we try to be trauma-informed and we try to be client-centered. So the students in our clinic, they become certified law students. And if you guys haven't seen them, they're wearing the blue shirts, and most of them, for some reason, decided to sit on that side. And so what we do is we write part of their training as certified law students for them to provide representation to our crime victims is they are taught about trauma. And that means like they are taught about what trauma is. They're taught about historical trauma, vicarious trauma, in order to prepare them for the meetings with their clients. Because what we try to do here at the clinic is we treat our clients as they are collaborators. We're working to empower them. And so that means that we try to provide them with their choice about what they want to do, whether that's cooperate with prosecution or not. So one of the funny things is that it's not so funny, but one of the things that we tell them is, we tell our clients that they are our bosses. So that means that at any time, they can pretty much fire us, our attorneys. But that hasn't happened yet. And so it's interesting that I was assigned to this panel with the prosecutors because the prosecutors decided to name their panel a trauma-informed approach to prosecution. So it was just coincidence that I happen to be here. And so how we're gonna get started is we're gonna have our prosecutors answer the same question that our survivors answered, and that is, what would they like to improve about the criminal justice system? And we also have our survivor here who will then ask questions. Okay. And if I could just ask each of the prosecutors, I know your names are already on the placards. If you could just state your name and perhaps talk about, just mention your title. Thanks. Who wants? Mr. Kim, would you like to get us started?
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Kim. I'm a deputy district attorney. I'm a career prosecutor. I've been at the DA's office here for 20 years. But before I go into everything, first of all, I just want to thank Professor Richards for inviting us here and bringing all this wonderful energy to this very worthy discussion. Thank you very much for that, Professor. And like I said, I've been working at the DA's office for 20 years. Most of my career I spent in our former gang division doing murder trials. And I mention that because that's something I want to share about the victims of violent crimes. Recently, for the past several years, I have been working in our hate crimes unit, and I also prosecute human trafficking cases involving forced labor, which is why it was so important to hear from individuals like Jimmy and Karen that we heard from today. I've been thinking about this topic since I was invited to participate, and it's an interesting topic because it really brings together two separate issues. One, you have all these constitutional rights for the defendant that are part of our Constitution: Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, Eighth Amendment, 14th Amendment, and those rights exist because they protect the defendant, or really all of us, any one of us who could become a criminal defendant at any time. It protects us from the powers of the state, the government. This is an interesting question because what we're talking about here are the rights of an individual against another individual who is presumed to be guilty or presumed to be innocent. So it's an interesting dialogue here. What are the rights of the individual against another individual that is open? And to give you context, I'd like to share with you some of the experiences that I have had as a prosecutor doing murder trials. A murder trial is a serious case because the victim is deceased, and the victims that are surviving are family members and their neighbors and their friends. And the one thing that happens often in these types of cases is they go to trial because the stakes are high, and because you're often talking about multiple defendants, sometimes you need dual juries, you're talking about a trial that will take many weeks or several months. And although our courts are open, and although there is enshrined within our Constitution rights, like the right for the media to participate in a criminal trial, there is no similar right for a victim's family to take time off from work and come to court. And you wouldn't really think about that because you would think, well, it's going to be a quick trial, but then we're talking about something that will last sometimes weeks, sometimes months. And I think that's something that could be improved. I think we can let people understand that when there's a serious case, that the family members, the survivors, have the right to take time off from work to attend the trial. Because that whole process is very healing, it's very cathartic. Because you at least understand, whatever the verdict is, you understand why it happened. You heard the witnesses testify. You saw the jurors' reactions. And regardless of what the result is, you can understand and accept it because you were part of it. But what happens is you can't be a part of it. As a prosecutor, generally, and I'm sure most of my colleagues, will call any victim's family at the beginning of the trial so that they can sit in and watch the rest of it. But I can't tell you how many times I would sit down with the family and they would say to me, they go, my boss said I have to go to work. And I've already taken a month off. But I still want to come. Is there anything you can do? Can you give me a subpoena? Which obviously I can. That would be an abuse of process. So that's something I think we should discuss, particularly when we're talking about victims of violent crimes, and particularly when we're talking about the surviving family members who are grieving, is how do we ensure that they have the right to participate at the trial? That was the first thing I thought about. Because I do hate crimes, I've learned something about crimes. I used to think, because I was mainly a murder prosecutor, that this is the most serious sort of case. But when I started handling hate crimes, I realized, a victim of a hate crime is in a very different situation. In the vast majority of instances, the victim is still alive. And whatever it is that caused that victim to be targeted for that crime is some quality about that person that they can't change. It could be the color of their skin. It could be who they love, their nationality, their religion. It's something very integral to that person. And when a victim of a crime, of a hate crime, is attacked because of that quality, it doesn't just affect that victim, it affects the entire community. And it affects the community in a way that it instills fear into everyone that shares that characteristic. So how do we address that? I think an improvement could be our Constitution. About 20 years ago, we passed a law, many of you are familiar with it, Marcy's Law, and it gives rights to victims of violent crimes. And really the sections are first like personal liberty and dignity, then there's like confidentiality and privacy rights, restitution, the right to be heard, the right to have input. Out of the 17 sections within Marcy's Law, 6 of them are not mandatory. The victim has to request to be informed if the defendant escapes. The defendant has to request to be informed of what happens if they're paroled. I think we should start a discussion about how we can improve the victim's standing within the criminal justice system and their rights that they have enshrined within the Constitution.
Would Would you like to go next, Tiffany?
I'm Tiffany Blacknell, and I am not a career prosecutor. I have been a DA for about a year. I started my career in the public defender's office, where I was for 18 years. And but before I get into the answers to the question, I think it's important to frame my perspective, where I come from. I grew up in South LA during a time where we had the highest murder rate in the nation. Next Friday is the 30th anniversary of the uprising in LA that I experienced at 15 years old. And going up in an environment where gang violence is prevalent, you were always adjacent to violence. You were always proximate to people who both cause harm and people who experience harm. And sometimes they were all in your family at the same time. So my introduction to violence was in utero. My father was a domestic violence abuser. My mother was a victim, and she carried very challenging aftermath of that abuse. And actually, it was prevalent in my family. I'm probably the first generation of women in my family who haven't experienced domestic violence. And so it's with that background, and also growing up where friends are murdered, or growing up where good friends are raped by people that you know, right, who are in local gangs, or growing up and being in a car where it was carjacked. I never thought of myself as a victim. Interestingly, it was always those, they were victims, I was just adjacent. When you're a child, those adverse child experiences carry over. And so now, in my work with the DA's office, and I'll just say, I met DA Gascon before he announced his run for election, when he was deciding. And the one thing I talked to him about, among others, that for our purposes, the most relevant thing, was I saw victims being arrested as a public defender. I witnessed uncooperative victims being either threatened with arrest or actually detained and kept in custody for weeks sometimes because they did not want to testify against their abuser. And that, to me, even as a defender, was an awful, awful, awful practice. And DA Gascon agreed, and we no longer do that in the DA's office. And so I brought that experience into the DA's office, and I became the community government liaison and the special advisor to DA Gascon for the last year and some change. And one of the first things he asked me to do was be the Crime Victim Advisory Board liaison. So I meet with them every month, and they discuss their experiences. And so from that, I was then appointed to be the interim director of the Bureau of Victim Services. And my replacement, I'm so happy she arrived. She arrived in the audience. She's the new director of Victim Services in our office. The thing that DA Gascon did when he became DA was he wanted to change who ran Victim Services. Historically, there's been a lawyer at the helm of that bureau. Now there'll be a person with a clinical psychology background. Because he wanted to separate the two. We have the legal wing of our office that prosecutes, and these gentlemen do it impeccably. And then you have the victim services piece. It must be completely independent and victim-centered. And here's why. The criminal legal system is an awful, awful process for everyone involved. For victims, for accused. In this need for efficiency, right, we rush through these very traumatic moments of a person's life with shocking regularity, and violence becomes mundane. And so you have both defender and prosecutor alike, you have cases, you have 6 different court appearances, and you are rushing around courtroom to courtroom and hardly ever looking into the eyes of the person who you are supposedly engaging. And so it's an awfully isolating process that I think we can improve by, number one, I think that we should have special protocols for certain types of victims. For childhood victims of sexual violence, they should not be cross-examined in a courtroom as crowded as this room. And I cross-examined 8-year-olds who were victims of sexual violence in crowded courtrooms. It is awful to do and awful to witness. And so I think that there should be a time frame where at the end of the day, when no lawyer wants to be in court, 3 o'clock on a Friday, you set those children in a space where it could be as close as hollow ground, because they are sharing with the world one of the most awful moments of their lives. I think that there should be practices where prosecutors spend time with victims who are especially vulnerable. And what I mean by that is that I think that the system oftentimes will prescribe how trauma should be manifest. So there are traditional victims and there is the non-traditional victims. There are victims who lash out angrily. Our sex trafficking victims are oftentimes African American women, and I can relate. All my college degrees and law degrees don't protect me from being an angry black woman, being called that. And what they are doing, they are survivors. And they're oftentimes angry at everyone around. And they do not want to be in the presence of their trafficker. And they do not want to describe what he did to them. And we should honor that. And honor their process. And not prescribe for them the way that we think they should behave as a result of their trauma. Right? I think that we should spend the time to build trust. Because the community does not trust us. They do not trust law enforcement. They do not trust public defenders. They do not trust prosecutors. And we need to earn it because we broke it long ago. While people were being arrested and being forced to cooperate, we broke their trust. And in victim services, the DA wants to expand the umbrella of the services that we provide to victims. Currently, the current state of funding in California, if you are an uncooperative victim, you don't get services. If the police kill your son in the middle of your living room, you're not entitled to cleanup, right? Imagine, if you are not willing to testify or willing to cooperate in the process, to me that's a sin. Because my trauma is for example, if you're on probation or parole, am I any less harmed because I was in the carceral system? Am I any less harmed? I don't feel safe with law enforcement to cooperate with them? No, I'm not. And these practices generally impact the same communities. Poor black and brown folks who are not trusting of the system. So we need to, number one, earn their trust by improving our protocols and our processes. And number two, we need to increase the way that we support survivors, both financially and also with therapeutic services. Because at the end of the day, the folks in prison have survived violence before they committed acts of violence, typically. That's my lived experience. 80+% of women who are in prison have been victims of sexual violence and victims of domestic violence. So if we were to improve our touch to increase services for those populations, we would actually reduce violence in the community. And that should be all of our collective goals. And we shouldn't have this sort of, you're a good victim so you get the support, and bad victims you get nothing. Because that only makes our communities less safe, because they're not receiving the treatment that they deserve, and that we all need to create safe communities.
I see Mr. Santizo getting ready, so I'll just let you go ahead.
It's a pleasure being here, and I appreciate Professor Richard having me be on the panel. I appreciate the way Tiffany began her discussion because my comments are shaped by my experiences. I've been a prosecutor for about 17 years by now, and for the last 9 years I've been assigned to the Sex Crimes Division. So I started out prosecuting child and adult sexual abuse cases. And then one day I started prosecuting sex trafficking cases. And I did that exclusively for about 6 years. And tough cases, all of them. But I feel like I've grown significantly as a prosecutor during my time in the Sex Crimes Division, but more significantly prosecuting those cases. I just interacted with different individuals involved in those cases. My comments, I don't think are wrong, I don't think they're right. They're just shaped by my own experiences of what I see, what I've experienced on an everyday basis, and what I've seen throughout my career. When we pre-met to discuss this panel, the question was posed, what should we call this panel? And it was changing how we deal with dealing with victims or improving. To me, I don't think we have a fundamental problem or issue with how we treat victims, but I do think we can improve them. Every day we can get better with how we interact with victims of crime. I can tell you, 17 years ago, when I joined this office, I had a different view. But now, 17 years later, and experiencing what I have and having discussions, not just with victims, but advocates, with defense attorneys, with others involved in the system, they have changed my perspective and my viewpoint. And I think I've just grown overall. Now, with all that said, how can we improve? And I think we're doing it right now by being here, by having these discussions. I've learned more about how to properly interact with victims by just talking to them and listening to them. I think we frequently, we're so worked up in our case and how to prove it, how to ensure we can successfully hold the person accountable for the crime, that things get lost and we don't listen. Now, that's not to say that we don't care about what a victim wants or what a victim says, but our role as a prosecutor is to ensure there's justice. And that's a loose term, right? That can be different for everybody, but we need to hold people accountable while at the same time protecting their rights of victims. Now, this whole concept of trauma-informed practices, when did I learn that? When I started prosecuting sex trafficking cases. There's an organization called Saving Innocence that are advocates for child sex trafficking victims. I learned that from them, by listening to them, by being in meetings with victims and with their advocates, just talking to them, learning how to speak to victims of sex trafficking. So it took me about 10 years of being a prosecutor to understand what trauma-informed is. And I believe if we start that process early on in the training of the DA, that'll be helpful. Now, I don't think you can walk in on day one and get taught a course on trauma-informed practices and there you go. It's a process that takes time over years of just interacting with victims and listening to them. Now, I will say that I'm proud of the work that we do as prosecutors, and just because the trauma-informed approach to our cases, sometimes the prosecutor doesn't recognize what the victim wants or what the victim needs. And with the proper training, I do think we can do better at that. Ultimately, I think whether you're a public defender, whether you're a prosecutor, you get into the practice because you truly care about the community, about victims of crime, or about, on the public defender side, the disenfranchised, the people that can't afford legal services. Now, when you heard that we have a new bureau director for our victim services, and another change that we can do is just have more staffing for victim service representatives. I work in a division where we have way too many cases, unfortunately. We have easily 150 open sex cases involving child and adult sex victims, including trafficking cases. We have 2 victim service representatives. If we have more, then the victim service representative can be more actively involved in connecting with the victims and outreaching. Just because the victim doesn't call you back doesn't mean that they don't care. There could be something else going on. So if we have more support from the victim services side, I think that'd be amazing. Another thing that I've noticed also over the last 6 months to a year is I feel like in law schools, they can impress upon the importance of students becoming prosecutors, becoming public defenders, and instilling them the importance of being part of our community. And you can be a valid prosecutor, doesn't mean you want to send everybody to prison, right? You can be a public defender, right? You can be reasonable, you can be fair. Let's expand the people that can join our profession, that have different lived experiences, that can truly perhaps connect with victims who are more open-minded. And I think that comes from places like this room, right? It's law schools to push people in this direction. And lastly, for the judges in this room, I think the judges could prioritize, as Tiffany says, those cases involving child victims. It's hard when you have a docket with 40 cases and you push, you're just trying to get that calendar done. But every person is different on that case, and I respect the fact that every defendant's different, but behind that defendant is going to be a victim. So we got to give them the time they need to get their testimony out, to get their information out, and not rush it along. Yes, it's a case number, but there's an experience behind that particular case number. Thank you.
And I'll go on this side. Mac or Maggie, would you like?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Maggie Krell. I work at the California Department of Justice, the Attorney General's office. I'll give you a quick background on me. I was a prosecutor for about 15 years, started as a deputy DA, and then worked my way up in the Attorney General's office, oversaw our human trafficking teams, and prosecuted a variety of other cases as well, murder cases, domestic violence cases, white-collar crime cases. I left DOJ for about 4 years. During that time, I was chief legal counsel for Planned Parenthood, so it really expanded my views in terms of looking at all of this through more of a public health perspective and kind of just sort of layering my experiences as a prosecutor with some different experiences of seeing some of these victims also as patients and looking at medical needs and access to healthcare and those issues. I also had the opportunity to represent survivors of sex trafficking in their private cases, both unfortunately when they were prosecuted criminally and then also in civil rights type cases. But I recently rejoined the Attorney General's office, so I'm now a special advisor to Attorney General Rob Bonta, and my portfolio is overseeing victim services, survivor policy, and survivor advocacy. I've heard some really great ideas already today. Probably the easiest thing I could do is just say, you know, what they said, referring, of course, to the first panel and also my colleagues who have shared so far on the second. I think there's just been some really insightful and important sharing that's already happened today. It makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm still kind of processing all of that. But I guess there's three things that kind of stick in my mind that I share out. One is I remember when I was a baby deputy DA, just the horror that I felt, because I was prosecuting misdemeanors, so all the defendants were out of custody, and my cases were like the last priority, like in the rungs of priorities. My cases were way at the bottom. So, and that's pretty much how most prosecutors start, right? So I would have to tell the victims or the witnesses who were coming to court that basically their cases were getting continued all the time. And, you know, I got to more serious cases, elder abuse cases, other kinds of cases, and the cases were getting continued all the time because there was such a backlog in the criminal justice system. And that's something that through the course of my career in the last 20 years has just gotten worse, and COVID made it even worse. And so the amount of time it takes to bring a case to justice, to bring a case from charging to trial, if it goes to trial, can take years. And that is just a crazy amount of time for a victim to wait, to kind of get their hopes up emotionally that they're going to testify, to get prepped, to maybe even go to the courthouse, to get childcare, to do all the difficult things that they need to do to get ready, and then be told in the hallway, actually there's not a courtroom, or actually the defense needs more time, or actually this is going to get pushed out for 2 months, for 4 months, for 6 months. That is really, really, really hard. So I would say number one is investing more resources into the judicial system. Public defenders need more resources so that they have crazy caseloads. When they say they need more time, it's so that they can provide effective assistance for their clients. The defendants have that right. It's a constitutionally protected right. So we need to make sure that there's enough of them to go around. Same with prosecutors, and of course, same with judges in courtrooms. So that would be one, to try and help catch up the backlog of cases and move more expeditiously through the court system. I think would really have a positive impact on victims in terms of them having the ability to get closure and move forward with their lives. Number two, I would say, is resources for survivors. And this is, you know, what I hear again and again up and down the state, just that that survivors need resources. And I'm especially talking about gender-based violence cases, but you know, they need to be able to have money to live independently from the person that was abusing them. They need to have access to mental health care. They need to have access to medical care. They need to have help with, you know, job development. And there's just barriers that exist anyway, you know, because of poverty and because of inequity in our system are just exacerbated by being a victim, by being traumatized. And so, you know, the more that our victim services can do to really connect survivors to resources that, you know, will help right away, that you know, don't involve clunky paperwork and more barriers, I think is really important. And then the third thing I'll say, and this is, probably the most challenging to articulate, is just that we have to recognize the confines of the criminal justice system. That, many survivors, and folks on the first panel talked about this as well, that many survivors don't come forward. They don't feel safe sharing with law enforcement. They don't feel safe sharing with their own public defenders. They certainly don't feel safe, sharing with the prosecutors on this panel, right? So they're not coming forward, but that doesn't make them any less deserving or less worthy of support if they've experienced trauma. So we need to find a way to better reach hard-to-reach communities. And I'm really I'm really leaning into the public health perspective on this, because as a lawyer for Planned Parenthood, I learned pretty quickly that, a lot of our patients, didn't make their appointments, didn't come back for lab work. We knew that there were things they needed, but it took a lot of follow-up. We had to go, straight into the communities. And I think that kind of community investment is really what we need to interrupt these cycles of violence. For so many of these families, and other people have shared this as well, this is cyclical. This is a cycle of violence. This is multi-generational trauma. So if we're going to disrupt that, it's really going to have to be investment and outreach and victim services that aren't confined to the DA's office, to the AG's office, to the criminal justice system. Thank you.
Mr. Jenkins, you can go ahead.
Thanks. And first, thank you for allowing us to be here, and thank you, Professor Richard and Rise. And I think it's been touched on a few times about how one of the solutions is clearly stuff like this. I think Guillermo said that, and I think that's absolutely right. And people like you, and people like us to listen. And I think maybe it was Jess who talked about having a relationship with your trauma and making space for your trauma. And I've dealt with a lot of trauma and victims in my cases. But I would say I'm not sure I was prepared for the amount of trauma listening to this today. So I feel like, Stephanie, you should have told me to clear out some more trauma space before I showed up today, because this has been very, very powerful, and so I appreciate that. And so my name is Mack Jenkins. I'm the Chief of the Public Corruption and Civil Rights Section at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles. Long way of showing that I'm a federal prosecutor, but I prosecute hate crimes. I prosecuted civil rights crimes involving human trafficking, also related to Jess. Again, I prosecuted law enforcement for sexual violence against people, including federal law enforcement. And I will say that's taught me a lot about dealing with that trauma. It's also taught me a lot about sort of the distrust that people have in positions of power. And it's also taught me a lot about how it's been said before that a lot of those perpetrators were also victims at some point. And I also, on my other hats on civil rights and public corruption, it's very different. In public corruption, think crooked politicians, very different. Not all of them have ever been victims. And so it's a different dynamic, and I see that a lot, having been juxtaposed versus the sort of human trafficker versus the wealthy politician bribing to become more wealthy. And so that to me has been important, the learning of how prosecutors need to listen. And I've said this before too, but it became quickly apparent to me that prosecution is never a panacea. It's not a cure-all. By the time it gets to me, it's too late. I want to intervene. A lot of people, and I think, again, like Guillermo said, we get into this, I'm sure Tiffany too, to try to make the world a better place. But I'm not saving the world as a prosecutor, and I never can. But I know I can make a difference because I do have a lot of power. Me personally, our office at the U.S. Attorney's Office, every federal prosecutor, every state prosecutor, we ultimately have a big decision on who gets charged, who is a victim, who is a witness, what they get charged with, what charges to, when they do get charged, to pick. Are there mandatory minimums involved? Those are the prosecutor's decisions, and we do wield a lot of power. And to me, a big important part of my job is learning how to do it better. And I think, again, listening has been a significant part of that process. But also, sort of where Tiffany started off, my background has also been pretty different. My family grew up in South LA as well. In 2016, I've been a prosecutor now for 14 years, so I've been a prosecutor about 8 years. My cousin, who was like my little sister, I don't have real sisters, so she was like my little sister, was shot in the back of the head and killed and dropped off in Long Beach. And this is why I'm a prosecutor. And I was a prosecutor prosecuting gang crimes. And this was her boyfriend was in a gang. And so that hit home for many reasons for me. And that was in 2016. He has still not been to trial. The alleged perpetrator, her boyfriend, has still not been to trial. It's 2022. And she is a victim who has, although terrible choices in lots of life, has a lot of family support. A family member, at least 1, 2, sometimes 10, go to court every time he has a hearing for 6 years. And for 6 years, they've been waiting for justice. And I know the DA. I've worked with the chief of police for Long Beach where this occurred. I know the district attorney and I had a relationship with her at the time it was charged, Jackie Lacey. And I still don't know what's happening. And so I think a lot about, what about the people who don't have the connections or the work experience? Or, people will take my call when I call about what's happening on the case. And very few people have that opportunity, and I still have very little insight into why it's taking so long. He's been arrested, he's sitting in prison, but he's had 5 different public defenders. He's had 3 different district attorneys. There's been 2 judges, and surely that is not justice. And so I bring it back to where Paul started it too. Defendants have advocated for themselves and advocates about significant rights in our country for defendants. And not to say that the rights between defendants and victims can ever be balanced, but it's clear that victims can get more rights through advocacy. It's clear that they need more rights. And it's clear like institutions like this and what Maggie is doing is designed to do that. And so I think focusing that energy on that change is possible. Change for defendants' rights has increased significantly. It can be the same for victims. And so the last couple of things I'll stop and off with are 2 concrete examples, because I think that was on our assignment too, to try to give actual concrete examples. To me, the most analogous one are collaborative courts. So courts where there's a prosecutor, a judge, a defense attorney, a service provider, a social worker. Think drug courts. 30 years ago, drug courts never existed. Now, today, drug courts are everywhere, and they're saving lives every day. 10 years ago, drug courts in the federal court didn't exist, and now there's federal drug courts everywhere. There's mental health courts, there's VA courts. And so I think collaborative courts designed around where a victim is someone who's charged with a crime, but also as a victim. Think the labor trafficking we've heard before, and the sex trafficking. Providing them an opportunity for a collaborative court where they don't have to wait 20 years to erase their record, where they're around other people who just listen, while they're at the same time educating that prosecutor and that judge about their experiences. So I think collaborative courts focus on the sort of individuals who straddle the line between victim and defendant is one solution I'd like to see. Second one is very basic. 2 years ago at the U.S. Attorney's Office, one of our ratings now is victim services, how we deal with victims. It's very basic, but a lot of lawyers like to be productive, a lot of get good grades. And so just putting it in their reviews, like how do you deal with victims? And I'll tell you, as a reviewer, because now I'm a supervisor, it makes a significant difference. So there are little things that we can do to make people aware and make real change, and change little by little, in the end, can make a significant impact.
Well, thank you so much to our prosecutors. And again, I want to acknowledge that there is a survivor, or we have a survivor sitting at the table. And I will let her introduce herself, and I will also invite her to reflect of anything that was said by any of the prosecutors, or ask a question. This is your time.
Thank you. My name is Pamela Michelle. I'm also a survivor of labor trafficking. Prior to my ordeal, I worked as a development director and a grant writer with nonprofit organizations. So I relied heavily on that background because, as some of our esteemed colleagues have said, there is a lack of support to survivors from the inception all the way through the prosecution. Personally, at least, I didn't have that support either, but I did have some background knowledge that I was able to pull in to help me get through the process. Took 4.5 years, a lot of delays along the way, and in terms of trying to get an outcome that would really put the trafficker away for a long time, I feel like the victims' impact statements are really, really important. And I wish there would have been some coaching for that. Like I said, I had information that I could rely on and reflect back on. But for most, that doesn't exist. I had the ability to speak in a way that, because I was used to connecting your heartstrings to your purse strings, I could kind of reach a judge in a very personal way that most victims aren't going to be able to do that. When I was going through the process, I was discouraged from talking to anyone about it. The prosecution, you don't want anyone to dispute what you've said, so the best way to ensure that is not to speak about it. Just don't say anything to anybody. So you kind of keep it on the, down low for years, waiting until it comes to that moment. And then how do you present in that moment to have the most impact? I believe that most traffickers, like the DV offenders, are serial offenders. You're probably not the first one in, and if they walk away, you won't be the last. So whatever we can do as survivors to help save the next person from being the next victim, I think that's really important. But what I love the best is the earning the trust. I thought that was so important, and I think that really nonprofit organizations are the key, because they're the umbrella. They're the ones that should be there. The police don't offer you the resources. It takes a long time before the prosecution even gets involved. I mean, from the time that the police are called and brought in until you even speak to someone from the prosecutor's office takes months. So I don't know how common that is now compared to 2005 when I escaped. Sounds like there's been a lot of improvement in the ways that are evolving in terms of a resiliency model, and how we do trauma treatment is being incorporated more than it was, a decade ago. So I applaud this effort to get everybody on the same page, and I pray with you on the trust building, whatever you all can do, and to help, whatever you think can be done to help victims create those impact statements.
Okay, and so we also have Judge Siegel sitting over here at the table, and also Angela Biramontes, and they have also been entrusted with asking questions of our panelists, so I'll let them go ahead.
All right. I am a former prosecutor. I was a prosecutor for 25 years. I think, as I recall, that victims want to have their voices heard, which is basically what you just said, at every stage of the process, including the arrest to charging, pleas, sentencing, parole, and release. How often do you think prosecutors seek the input of victims, in your experience? Anyone?
I'll go ahead and answer that. I know that in serious cases, like in murder cases, you're going to be talking to the victim's family. It's going to be a process, as Mack just mentioned, that will take many years. Not quite so many years, hopefully, but it does take time. And I think that one of the important things for a prosecutor to do is to inform the victim's family and let them know what to expect. That this is going to be a process. Just like you let your witnesses know what to expect before they testify, what kinds of questions that they're likely to anticipate on cross-examination, that they should be honest and try to answer the question as thoroughly as they can. I think we should give the victims all of that. And that kind of brings me back to what I was originally talking about with Marcy's Law. There are so many sections that require the victim's family to request information, and they shouldn't have to request it. They should just be given that information.
To add that, although I wanted my esteemed colleagues to speak because I've never prosecuted a case, but I will say that DA Gaston, I think I can speak for the Gaston administration in that the first thing he did back a month after he was elected was to create a crime victim advisory board. And that board is comprised of people who have survived gun violence, sexual violence, stalking, et cetera. And we meet with them to hear their perspective. And they are not shy about telling us what failed in their particular circumstances. And to my colleague's point about his cousin, in that case, one of our members on the advisory board has two brothers killed in gang violence 5 years apart. And she advised me how, she's not been contacted by the office, right? And this is someone on our advisory board. And so for me, I think that that's a step in the right direction from an administrative point of view, having that advisory board to tell us where we're going wrong and what we've done wrong. And I think that gives us all a different perspective. And I certainly don't know everything, but I love hearing from them. I run almost everything by that board. They're probably getting tired of me, but I think that's part of this, is having folks at the table, a seat at the table for community members to speak and tell us what they've experienced.
I'll just add in, to the point of your question. I mean, victims of crime are just, not a monolith, and every case is different, and every survivor presents with, different needs and different experiences. And, I've certainly had cases where the person wants to know every single thing that's going on, and they're going to come to every hearing, and they're going to call me afterwards, and we're going to spend a ton of time together going over it. I've also had survivors that really want nothing to do with it, and it's like the less I can trouble them, like the better things will be. So I think it's important just to listen and just really, receive their honest feedback and, react to it the best you can.
I have to comment, that's very true, because a lot of survivors, they know what's coming, they won't even approach that, because they would rather just try to pretend it didn't happen and move forward rather than face it day to day for months or years, because we're going to face it for the rest of our lives, but to have it present in your day-to-day life for such a long time is more intrusive than you can imagine.
Anyone else? Angela?
Thank you. One of the things that we've heard today, and I've seen in my own practice as a federal public defender, is identification at the charging phase, whether someone's seen as a victim or whether someone's seen as a defendant. And I guess for each of you in your respective offices, what do you think your offices can do to improve in the identification of victims?
I can speak to that. Actually, this is a current love project of mine with unsolved homicide victims. I know that currently we do rely upon law enforcement to connect victims and next of kin of homicides with our Office of Bureau of Victim Services where they can get services. But sometimes there's a gap. So right now we partner with the OVC to do sort of a deep dive into the Bureau of Victim Services to figure out what aspect of victims are we missing in our outreach to see how can we improve that process so that we can reach more people. And as far as homicides go, like you said, we don't know until we have a case. And some of these, we talked about this a few weeks ago at a press conference. In 2021, I believe 40% of homicides were solved by LA Sheriff. That's 6 in every 10 murders in LA Sheriff jurisdiction that there's unsolved. With the families that are still grieving, that haven't received answers. And so we want to do more work to both partner with communities so that we can support those that victim population, but not just homicide. So what we started conversations around the coroner, since they are the ones who notify folks next of kin. We want them to also reach out and give them some information from the DA's office, since they won't listen to us directly, but to the DA's office so that we can provide them with services. So that's what we're doing in homicide. After we solidify that protocol, the next step is how do we support survivors who are in other types of crimes, sexual violence, etc., who may not want to even enter the criminal legal system, and do it at an earlier stage.
I also think it's just a training issue, and I can just speak from my own perspective. So when I first started doing sex trafficking cases, I don't know how familiar you are with the way it works, but there's frequently a person involved called the bottom. The bottom girl is typically the most trusted commercial sex worker for the trafficker. And there was always these discussions that I was having with, at the time, my supervisor and just other people is, do we charge the bottom? Right? Do you charge them for trafficking at 14, 15-year-olds? And it's the role of the prosecutor to decide, well, why are they doing it? Are they doing it because they're being compelled to do it by the actual trafficker, or is there something else going on? So it's a training issue, really, and I think also it comes down to experience, right? If you have somebody filing a certain type of case that's never tried one of those cases, they're not going to recognize who the actual defendant needs to be, who's the actual victim. So I think it's just a training and experience issue.
Yeah, I would echo what Guillermo said too, and I think sort of to my last point, it's been much more focused at the U.S. Attorney's Office. through our reviews, but there's a system in place where we're required before we charge a case to identify any victims. But there's mandatory victims, and then there's sort of collateral victims or indirect victims. So I don't know if that was part of your question, but part of it is who do you identify as a victim in terms of notification process, and a lot of it depends on the person. We have a victim person who's in charge of doing the automatic notifications and putting us in contact. But often we want as many people, the victim's family, to be notified as possible. And so it's a conversation. But again, like Guillermo said, it depends on what relationship you have with your victim's person, what the rule is in that office, because mandatory victim can be defined very narrowly, and oftentimes people think it's too hard to find out who the victims are. Let's just skip that box. But the other thing I want to say is that what I've seen effectively sometimes is when the judges ask, has the victim been notified, or are there any victim family members present? And obviously they want to do it in a way that's thoughtful if the victim doesn't want to be identified. But I've seen that in court be very effective for when the next hearing, the judge asks that same question, has the victim been notified or the victim's family about this hearing? And that AUSA was very prompt in that response and much more educated. But I think, not to put it on the judges and Judge Kinn, but some of this I think they impact a lot, both the prosecutors and just for the victims who do want to be identified. Like, for example, when my family shows up to my cousin's 45th status conference, the judge recognizes them, said, I see the victim's family is here again, and we appreciate that. And I think the defendant notices, the district attorney notices, so then he is more communicative. So again, not to put it all on the judges, but sometimes they play a significant role too.
I think that's it, but I want to thank all of everybody sitting here at the table. I personally would like to say that I'm really glad that our student attorneys are here. I think that sometimes I get more nervous presenting in front of them. And that's because they are the next generation of attorneys. And so I really hope that they take away from all the prosecutors that are up here, from the survivors, and really understand that how important it is to hear our survivors and to provide them with the voice, and how important their work will be in the future. Thank you so much.